And now, ladies and gentlemen,
put your thumbs up and say it's Tickety Boo.
Tickety Boo.
Tickety Boo, Tickety Boo, everything's Tickety Boo.
Tickety Boo, son. Tickety Boo.
Tickety Boo!
Welcome to another exciting episode of Tickety Boo. We're thrilled to have you join us today, and whether you're a long-time fan or a newcomer to our podcast, we appreciate every one of you that tunes in. In this episode, we're diving into a rather important topic, anxiety. Anxiety was the theme of Mental Health Awareness Week 2023. And today we're going to shed light on this often misunderstood and yet incredibly common mental health condition. Now, if you've been enjoying our content so far, please take a moment to hit that subscribe button. By subscribing, you'll never miss an episode and you'll be the first to know when we release new content. Now, in an increasingly uncertain world, our mental well-being is constantly being challenged, resulting in alarmingly high levels of anxiety. In the UK, anxiety now ranks amongst the most prevalent mental health disorders. Anxiety now impacts the lives of millions of people around the world, and it can manifest itself in many different ways. So to help us better understand anxiety and its impact, we shall take a bit of a deep dive into the subject to help you understand it a bit more and to provide some practical hints and tips along the way. So let's get into this. Hi Suzanne.
Hi Andy, how are you?
I'm good. Are you ready to talk all things anxiety?
Looking forward to it.
Or are you feeling anxious about not feeling anxious while talking about anxiety?
Butterflies in the stomach, little bit of sweaty palms.
Yeah, it's anxiety is this. We just seem to be living in a really anxious world right now, don't we? I can't recall a time in my lifetime where anxiety levels haven't been as high. I mean, I've got different opinions on why I think we are this anxious planet. I think some of it's got to do with post-COVID, but, you know, from your perspective, what's your view on this anxious world we seem to be living in right now?
Yeah, it does seem to be very prevalent at the moment, and a lot of it, you know, is the situations that we find ourselves in post-pandemic. There's a lot more awareness of it. There's a lot more discoveries round about, you know, what mental health challenges there are both in the NHS and, you know, looking out for each other's mental health and becoming aware of it, having mental health first aiders at work, being able to diagnose potentially more people, but not necessarily having the support mechanisms around there for the framework to support them in an adequate way. We've still got a bit of catching up to do there, but that doesn't stop the situation from happening. It doesn't stop people from experiencing these. And we've got so many different aspects of it just now. We've got the cost of living crisis. We've got, as you said, the post-pandemic. There's a lot of redundancies happening at the moment. It literally is, this future is very uncertain for a lot of people. People feel they've lost what little control they possibly had over their finances and their family life.
And, you know, feeding into the last episode where we talked very much about sense of self and how that can lead to insane levels of anxiety. Yeah. But yeah, you're right. I think we, through the media, through social media, we've created this anxious planet. News and information is coming at us now at a rate of knots that we are just not used to. And yeah, there's definitely been this shift post-pandemic. And, you know, when we talk anxiety, you know, we've got this sliding scale, haven't we? We've got full-blown panic attacks, the pressure valve's gone, or we've just got this constant sense of unease. I'm on edge, you know, the impending doom. Something's not quite right. I don't know what it is, but I can't quite put my finger on it. So, you know, in this episode today, I really kind of wanted to sort of spend a bit of time talking about anxiety and also from a therapist's perspective of what we're seeing in the therapy room, but also give out some hints and tips and things that you can do, or, you know, maybe a loved one or is struggling with anxiety right now.
and give that support, because it is not just the person who experiences it, the anxiety, it's actually the impact on their immediately their tight circle, their close circle of, you know.
Yeah.
It doesn't just stop it, it impacts the workplace, and yeah, we definitely need to know how to support people as well as support ourselves.
Yeah, and at a point in life where actually getting access to help has never been more difficult. You know, we are simply not good enough, certainly in this country, at helping people with mental health. If you're in crisis or you're struggling, it can be incredibly difficult to get support or to get good quality support. And, you know, when you're in crisis state with your mental health and you can't get an appointment with your GP, or you've maybe been referred and you're on a waiting list that could be 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, at one point, 2 years. Where do you go? What do you do? Because an hour in anxiety
It's too much.
is hell. You know, I'm just looking at some of the stats in front of me. It's saying that in any given week in the UK, 6 in 100 people are diagnosed with generalised anxiety. I actually think the numbers are higher than that.
Well, that's the people that are actually going to
Yeah.
seek help and,
Yeah.
and have the courage to speak to their GP about it,
Yeah.
or have reached that threshold where they need that
Yeah.
that help.
Well, there's another stat there that leads nicely into that less than 50% of people with anxiety actually get access to treatment.
Wow.
I know, yeah. So they reckon at the moment there's around 8 million people in the UK that are struggling with an anxiety disorder. So there's approximately 4 million people floating around right now really struggling with anxiety, and they are getting no help at all. And that creates a bigger problem, doesn't it? Because, you know, if left unchecked, it can lead you down into, you know, to depression, suicidal thoughts, unhealthy coping mechanisms, drink, drugs, food, gambling. It can completely destroy lives.
It'll have an impact potentially financially, because you might not be able to function anymore at work.
Yeah.
The impact in relationships,
Yeah.
both your intimate and your family relationships, as well as friendships.
Mm-hmm. Kids
The
unable to go to
potential-
school or do exams. People are not able to go out and socialise and get out into the community and do things.
It's quite a significant impact. I didn't realise the numbers were as high as that.
Yeah, they're quite frightening. And the thing is, with early intervention with anxiety is really important, because the longer it runs on, and we'll talk about it in a bit more detail today, the more slow building triggers that you tend to build up. And anxiety is very good at kind of getting your world and taking it from this size to this size. And what we do, as we've talked on previous episodes, is when we feel uncomfortable, we withdraw. So anxiety leads us into doing lots of avoidance. We avoid the things that make us feel uncomfortable. But what nobody told us at school was avoidance feeds anxiety. The more you step away from something, the more the anxious part of your brain goes, there must be a threat there, so don't worry, I'm going to keep the anxiety up to keep you safe. And I think you know, our relationship with anxiety has changed. You know, I think when I was a kid, I had a lot of anxiety, but I just thought I worried a lot.
Well, that's a really good point, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, like, I suppose I was too young as a kid to know what anxiety was, but I definitely knew I worried about lots of things I probably shouldn't be worrying about. I think, you know, there's a definition, isn't there, between worry and anxiety. It's when that worry starts to interfere with daily life. then we're looking, at it becoming some form of. I was about to make the mistake of saying anxiety disorder, and I hate the phrase disorder. It is a terrible label that you can place upon somebody that they have an anxiety disorder or a panic disorder, because they immediately think there's something wrong with them.
That's a really good point, isn't it? Just how even we reference it, implies that there's you've got
it's not a disorder; it's a response. You are struggling with an anxiety response. We don't go to the doctors and go, I'm not happy with my happiness response when I'm in good situations. I'm not happy with my humour response. Fundamentally, we need to remember that anxiety is an emotion. Yeah. Okay, it's a bloody uncomfortable emotion, but it is an emotion that starts out as a messenger. Is everything okay? The problem comes when left unchecked and not dealt with, or the environment is not looked at. We're then talking about something very different.
It feeds upon itself and becomes self-perpetuating and can build up momentum.
Yeah. I mean, one of the best things I could say to anyone listening to this episode is if you struggle with anxiety, the earlier you can get to deal with it, the quicker the recovery is. The longer you stay in those patterns and the more ingrained they become into your daily responses, creating these new neural pathways of responses. I'm not saying you can't undo it, you just need to do more work. Today I wanted to talk a bit about kind of what I'm seeing in the therapy room, what's going on in the world, why it's kind of happening as much as it is, and hopefully give the viewers of this episode some hints and tips and a bit of insight, because nobody educates us about anxiety, do they?
No.
Nobody, well, certainly for my generation, we never talked about anxiety, and certainly my parents and my parents' parents, anxieties and depression was taboo. You was masked. You didn't. I don't know. Was there mental health when I was a kid? Was mental health a thing? And obviously, mental health was a thing, but was it a thing that was acknowledged?
That's a really good question. Possibly it came under different guises. So, for example, we used to have, and possibly society was actually really quite cruel and brutal back in the day. I can remember certain people as I grew up where they were labelled as being crazy. All of the sort of terms that we don't tend to use anymore because it's got the negative connotations. It's quite slanderous. It's not great. But we definitely had individuals that were labelled as such, but it wasn't talked about in a mental health capacity that there was something wrong with them. It was just like, oh, don't go near them.
Yeah, I can remember being at school with certain kids that now I can look at, and, they were treated horrendously for what I can see now were anxiety-based conditions and responses, and probably traumatized by the way that they were treated, because no one really understood what was going on.
And possibly that still even happens today, Andy, because I don't know that enough people are aware of. I mean, hopefully we can change it through this.
Yeah.
And the more we talk about it, the more we normalise it and the more educate it can only be for the betterment, especially for kids. Because I think that still happens today. I've certainly had personal experience in the school environment, the educational environment, where we've had a good response to situations, but also a negative response, which has not been helpful and has actually been quite detrimental.
Yeah. The thing is, anxiety doesn't discriminate. It doesn't care what background you're from, how much money you've got, how healthy you are. None of us are immune to it. We talked in the last episode about our sense of self and how sometimes we can lose that a bit, and that's definitely a breeding ground
Sure.
for anxiety. I know that, I talk to my clients in the therapy room about this. There's a percentage of the population that definitely have an ability to do anxiety better. I'm amazing at anxiety. I see if like the UK had an Olympic squad, I would be captain of the anxiety team. Oh, like you would not believe. I mean, I'm so much better than I was. I have now what I call positive anxiety, which we can delve into later in the episode. But I was amazing at anxiety, from overthinking scenarios, ruminating, catastrophizing. I didn't know it was catastrophizing. I was just worrying, trying to control things before they even happened. And there's this thing that you may have heard of called high creative intellect. And people with high creative intellect just have this ability to freak themselves out. They can see things almost in full glorious technicolor in front of them. Their thoughts literally trigger their anxiety. Almost, I could imagine conversations that hadn't happened, or I could imagine situations unfolding, and create anxiety with no real threat in front of me. It was all a perceived type threat. But not everyone has the ability to do that. There's this, what they call the 70-30 club. There's about 30% of the world's population have this high creative intellect. And they're creative people, people like Steven Spielberg, artists, painters, musicians, people that are just very creative. They're born with this blessing that turns into a curse when it's pointed back at ourselves. And we do anxiety. So we can have stuff in the world that happens to us that creates anxiety.
Okay.
We can get bullied, accidents, pandemics, illnesses, financial issues. But those things don't happen to us, unless we're very unlucky, every single day for the rest of our lives. So what happens from those moments forwards is we start to do anxiety. How many people do anxiety? I'm not saying we sit there and go, oh, I know, I'm going to traumatize myself. But we do sit there, and anxiety is something that we do.
Yeah, so for me, I had like a storytelling. I could tell the world's best horror story to myself about a situation that hasn't yet happened, and come out with all of the different outcomes, almost like if option A happens, then this will happen, and if option B happens, then this could happen. And before I knew it, I was away down working out how I would deal with it, how I would control something. And it was based on something that hadn't happened, that hadn't even happened, of one of a different set of events. Do you know, and I was about 6 different levels down before you'd catch yourself and go, I need to understand that actually. But when you're in the thick of it, that's very difficult to catch yourself. Oh,
yeah, really bad. Anxiety loves to turn us into time travellers.
Oh, that's
you've jumped into your DeLorean, you've hit 88 mile an hour, you're in the future, you're viewing the situation in your mind, and you're working really hard to control something that's not even happened yet. Or alternatively, you're back in the past looking at something that's gone, it's over, there's nothing you can do about it. And anxiety is a state shift. We are not in the present moment. It's, in my opinion, it's a form of hypnosis. We go into these anxiety trances where we're completely shut out. Everything that's going on around us, we become very aware of what we're feeling, and we become very engrossed in thought, whether that's something bad's going to happen, there's some, I'm losing my hair, or, I must do this, I must do that. Our emotions have completely almost put like this brick wall up around us. shut prefrontal cortex activity down, so there is no rational thinking going on at all. Emotions are running the show.
And not being regulated.
Yeah, no regulation.
Just
Chaos. I often talk to my clients about this in the therapy room and some people watching this may resonate with them, is our anxious brain is like a naughty puppy. So if for those of you that have ever bought a pet, in particular, like a dog, so you've got this puppy and it's just belting around the room. It doesn't know how to sit, so it's just flipping around the room. That's your brain. It's just going around the room at 100 mile an hour. Mm. And a bit like the dog that needs to be taught the word sit means sit and be still. We have to train ourselves or our minds not to do that. So part of dealing with anxiety is using the right set of tools to deal with the feelings or the thoughts and do it consistently. I think a lot of people that struggle with anxiety, you've probably heard this phrase, have fear of fear. Mm-hmm. Because it's horrendous. It's the most horrendous feeling in the world, especially those that get panic attacks and then maybe work really hard to hope they don't have another panic attack, so they get like panic disorder, and that life's about that not happening again.
Yeah, protecting themselves from it.
Yes, staying in this kind of protective state. And the reality is, if you want to get better from anxiety, it's what you do in those moments of when you feel anxiety that will ultimately determine how quickly you get better. But because by the very nature of how anxiety makes us feel, we go, I just need someone to take this away. Take my anxiety away.
Completely.
Yeah.
But actually it serves, when you're not in that state, mm-hmm. It's there, and it's there for a reason. It is there to protect us. Mm-hmm. It's when it becomes, like you say, it's something that is out of control and impacts the way we live our daily lives. Yeah. That's the bit. But yeah, you can't ever you can take the unnecessary anxiety away, I imagine.
Yeah.
But not actual anxiety itself. There's
kind of like healthy anxiety, mm-hmm. and then there's excessive anxiety. Look, although I talk openly about my past with anxiety, my anxiety has also led me to achieve some fantastic things in my life. My anxiety has pushed me, has driven me, and I don't want to lose completely that part of me, because it's always trying to figure out where's the pitfall. It's just when that gets out of check, when it's allowed to go too far. Mm-hmm. And when you're walking around with this supercomputer in your head that nobody's told us how to use, nobody's taught us how to regulate our physiology and our psychology. So what do? We go, I'm really anxious, I need a drink. Or I'm really anxious, I need some medication, or whatever unhealthy coping mechanism
that you develop from it, mm-hmm.
that we can develop at it. But most of our anxiety issues, again, we're probably going to say this 1,000 times on this podcast. Most of our anxiety issues, and most of the people that end up in my therapy practice, their anxiety is linked to stuff way back, mm-hmm. like in the past. Traumatic events, things that happened during childhood, illnesses, the environment that we live in,
experiences.
Yeah,
and there's quite a lot of books that talk around about that, isn't there? And it's better to sort of express your emotions than to keep them suppressed mm-hmm. and inside, because they will come back. They actually don't disappear if you keep them inside. So, Andy, you were mentioning about the different types of anxiety there, and how you wouldn't want to remove it altogether. Mm-hmm. Is that something that where you are now, or is that something that you work on every day?
No, so don't get me wrong, now and again my anxiety can get out of check, But the difference is I know the tools to deal with it. When we're tired, mega stressed, it is much harder to regulate our emotions. Fundamentally, anxiety is an emotion. It's always more difficult to regulate our emotions when we're tired, when we're not eating well, when we're really stressed. But I would say I've now got a much healthier relationship with anxiety. Anxiety doesn't run me the way that it did in my past, where I was anxious Andy. Everything was a stress, was a worry. But left unchecked, a bit like going out and leaving the kids in the house at a certain age, if not kept in check, my brain has definitely got the ability to go off and do anxiety. And I think, you have to realise that there are certain people out there that just have this ability to do anxiety to a different level. That's the way that they were born, and that's the way that their mind operates. And that's okay. You can live a perfectly good life as long as you've got the strategies to keep your anxiety in check. And the problem is most people haven't. I compared to how I was back in the day, I was an anxious fruitcake. Like you wouldn't believe. Horrendous panic attacks, constant anxiety everywhere, people pleasing.
It can be a big one.
Yeah, having to be liked, worrying about everything, looking for the danger in every situation. Horrible place to be in.
I can imagine. I had a sort of control side of things, but what you're describing, it's almost overwhelming. At what point did you realise this has got to stop, or it's going to take me down, or it's going to completely sap my energy and overwhelm me as an individual and the way I live my life?
It's easy for me to look now and say I was anxious for a massive part of my life. So, there were certain events that have happened to me over my life that were traumatic, not necessarily in the way we would think when we use the word trauma, but they were traumatic to my mind, from experiencing my mum and my dad splitting up and the fallout from that at a very early age, and not really understanding what was going on other than things had changed and life wasn't the same anymore, but had no idea how to handle those emotions. Nobody spoke about them. Nobody checked you were okay. So I did anxiety from a very early age, probably the age of 6 or 7, right up into my 30s. But it was building. It was great, we started here and we got here. So what went from worrying every day and the ability to overthink stuff turned into horrendous anxiety attacks and horrendous panic attacks, where driving to somewhere or jumping on a plane. One of the most horrendous panic attacks I ever had was on a plane, and I was convinced I was dying on that flight. 'Cause, anyone that's ever had a panic attack will tell you it is the most horrendous thing. I would rather break a bone than have a panic attack, because I know I can go to the hospital, they can put a blast gas. I actually ended up in A&E once. Well, no, tell a lie. I ended up in A&E lots of times with panic attacks, but this one particular time I ended up in A&E, and the blood pressure and heart rate off the Richter scale. And I remember this doctor turning around to me going, "You just need to calm down." Really?
And did it work?
No. Oh my God.
Strangely enough.
Yeah, it was, of all the things you could have said to me in that moment, it was probably the worst thing. I got so fed up of living with anxiety that I decided to educate myself about anxiety. I think probably a lot of people that have struggled with it in their life have just kind of gone, I just need to get on with it. This is just the way that I am, but it doesn't need to be like that. And I'm, GPs are getting better, but they need to get much better, because automatic medication is, in my opinion, not the answer. It's not the solution for anxiety. Yes, it can bring about a period of stability, but something needs to change.
Yeah. So it's almost hopefully giving them that space from the anxiety to look at and do the actual work as to what's happening.
Yeah, because most people, I believed in order for me to get better from anxiety, I shouldn't feel anxiety. So I spent so much of my time trying to control my environment and risk assess everything and do avoidance so I didn't feel anxiety. And if I did that, I convinced myself that I was getting better. But the problem is sometimes you do need to get on a plane or drive a car or do these things. Then what do you do?
When you've got no alternative and you actually have to do this very thing that you're anxious about.
Yeah, and again, when I look back at life back then, because of the way that anxiety makes you think, feel and behave, the things that you do actually make your anxiety worse.
Okay.
Yeah, we create this perfect breeding ground for anxiety. So, and we should maybe spend a bit of time talking about the things that we do that actually makes our anxiety worse. I suppose I was lucky, the latter part of my anxiety, more so, but Google wasn't about when I had anxiety.
Oh, that's a really good point, actually. Did you have many books in the library, in the school library or the community library that... No,
anxiety just wasn't... I didn't... Panic attack was in my world before the word anxiety was in it. And there was a point in my life where I couldn't link panic attacks and anxiety together. I didn't understand that, a panic attack is just anxiety getting to the limit, the pressure valve, the pressure cooker, the valve's ready to go. Yeah. And that's where the panic attack comes from. So I didn't, I can remember a point in my life where I didn't know what anxiety was, but I knew what a panic attack was. But fortunately, I didn't have Google, because if I went and Googled symptoms, my anxious brain would have latched onto anything that I read and gone, yeah, I can manifest anxiety from that. So if you are watching this episode and you're struggling with anxiety, stay off Google. Don't research anxiety. Because kind of like anxiety is my sort of niche, I very often get asked to join these Facebook groups, like anxiety sufferers, and most of them, not all, but most of them, they're just all in there triggering each other, setting each other off. Oh, this has happened to me today, and blah 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 blah. And my view is, if you want to get better, go and hang around and speak to people that have either got over anxiety or who aren't anxious. Don't hang around with a bunch of anxious people.
I can see that. Yeah, again, that's self-perpetuating, isn't it?
Yeah, you're constantly triggering yourself.
Comes back to that revolving, just going round that Groundhog Day rather than evolving and coming out of it. Yeah.
So most people can't understand how they end up feeling anxious. Some have got very clear, lines in the sand. I was in a car accident. I was ill. I nearly died. I was assaulted. A relationship came to an end. I lost my business. There's 101 reasons, and you can go, I can put a pin in the map and go, that's why I've got anxiety. But there's a whole other category of people that go, I've not had, I've had a good life. My parents were good to me. My school days were great. But I've got really bad anxiety. And fundamentally, that person is just struggling with their brain firing off all of these false alarms. Our anxiety response is very primitive. The part of the brain, the amygdala, these two tiny things in the bottom of the brain that run the fight or flight response. It's a really primitive part of the brain. It hasn't evolved at all, really, compared to the rest of the brain. So we get these primitive fight or flight responses, which fundamentally is go back to your cave, light the fire, and just never come out the cave again, and we'll stay alive.
Which, to be fair, has served us well to date, because the human race is we're still here.
We're here.
We are here.
We're here.
So it's done its job in maintaining our well-being and our survival. But yeah, a lot of today's stresses and triggers, we don't need the same responses as we had back in the Neolithic days, when we were looking to fight for our lives. But that part of that brain hasn't developed, which in one sense is fantastic.
Yeah.
But then you get the flip side, where we live in a different world now.
Totally different world. And that response of run, hide, curl up in a ball, fight, freeze. Okay, yeah, at one time it served a purpose, and to a certain extent today it still serves a purpose, but we're living in a very different world. We can't say to your boss, I'm not coming out of my cave because the amygdala won't let me. Because that's what my response wants to do. Sorry, I need to avoid coming into work to keep my anxiety in check. So, to understand why anxiety is bad, we need to look at the way that the amygdala works and the way that our brain works. So, our brain works very hard to avoid things that make us feel uncomfortable. Yeah. So if you've had something bad happen to you, whatever that may be, the moment that happens, your brain goes, that sucked. That really sucked. So from today, you don't even need to ask me to do this. I'm going to do this for you. I'm going to create anxiety when you try and go and do that in the future. So, you think about... Right, yeah. Have you ever been, I don't know, maybe you did at school, you had to stand up and read in front of the class, or...
We had Burns Day, when you had to stand in front of the school if you were good enough at saying your poem, and say it in front of the entire school.
Yeah.
Wow.
So, you teacher points at you, right, you stand up, you read that chapter in front of the class. You're dead anxious, you stand up, you fumble your words, your mates are all laughing at you, the teacher kind of goes, you're an idiot or whatever, or sit down, you're rubbish. And fast forward 20 years and your boss is going, we need you to do a presentation on Monday to the team about so-and-so. And the brain went, oh, there was this time in life where we had to stand up and it was eyes on and we got criticised and it was really uncomfortable. I don't want that happening to you again today, so here's anxiety, so you'll run back to your cave, light the fire and not come out. And there's everyday scenarios where we can understand this, so if you decided to leave your house today, go for a nice walk through the park, beautiful summer's day, and suddenly out of nowhere this vicious dog appeared. And you're like, oh my God, where did the dog come from? And it bites you. That's an unpleasant experience. You have been traumatized. You're probably going to have to go to the hospital, get some stitches, have a tetanus shot. It's very easy for us to go, well, I can understand after that event that I would probably have a bit of an issue around dogs or walking through the park on my own,
open spaces.
Or spaces, because your brain is doing its job. It's going, this really uncomfortable thing happened to me, and in order to stop it happening again, this is what we're going to do. So probably to the new generation that are watching this episode, the way I like to explain it is think of your mind as Netflix. Yeah. So, when you go into Netflix, you've got all these different box sets, but they tip them into genres, don't they? So you've got horror, documentaries, blah, blah, blah. tried to think as, your brain has got like a Netflix catalogue in there.
Well, that's like an interesting way of looking at it. Okay, go
Yeah,
on. Go
and
on.
then for everything that you do in life, there is a box set down in the basement that predetermines how you respond to events. So you've got a box set for driving, you've got a box set for doing sport, or for relationships, for going on holidays. And sometimes these box sets are populated with bad stuff. So we go back to the kid who was humiliated standing up in front of the class. In their box set around public speaking, whenever his boss has said to him, right, Monday you're doing a presentation to the team, outside of his awareness, conscious mind goes down, his unconscious mind goes to that episode and goes, public speaking, what do we expect to happen about this? Oh, it's horrendous, avoid. Here comes all these feelings of anxiety. They're triggers, stuff that sets you off. And this happens to all of us on an ongoing basis. Our Netflix catalogue is constantly been updated.
Be updated.
Good and bad.
So that catalogue, is that almost like experiences, and then from on the back of that, beliefs that have formed off of the back of those experiences, in order to keep us safe? Yeah,
probably the best way for me to explain it, I mean, it's more visual for those who are watching on YouTube. I'll try and do some audio commentary for those that aren't, is that the amygdala is kind of like this sort of sphere. And in its off position, it's like this. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, we use the example of you're walking down a dark alley, and you walk down a dark alley and somebody jumps out the shadows and the amygdala goes, and, fight or flight response then kicks in. The amygdala hijacks the clear, calm, rational thinking of the brain, says, I'm taking control now. Yeah. And it decides what you're going to do. And then you run away and you get home and you're safe and well and all the rest of it. And it should calm back down. Yeah. Now, what nobody ever certainly told me, and I like to educate my clients about, is the amygdala is part of the brain that learns through experience. It doesn't understand language. So as a clinical hypnotherapist, one of the things people say to me is, hypnotize me to take anxiety away. Well, first of all, that's not going to work, because this doesn't understand language. It learns through experience. But it's actually what happens when the amygdala is activated that's really, really interesting. So whatever you're doing, we'll use the analogy of the kid that stood up in the classroom, stood up, fumbled the words, everyone started to laugh, anxiety response is done, amygdala has fired. What actually happens is the amygdala takes a picture. So think of the amygdala turns into like this scanning video camera, and it takes in, what could I hear? What could I feel? What could I see? What time of day was it? Where was I standing? All of this information, like a freeze frame, gets all of that information as a packet of fear and goes, right, I'm going to store this information in the amygdala now. And now what we're going to do is we're going to scan. We're going to constantly scan your environment to look for any data that matches this fear that we're now holding into the amygdala. And if we see anything that's exactly the same as this situation, mildly the same as that situation, or so vague, you would go, how have you made that match? I'd rather be safe, and I'm going to tip you into fight or flight. Mm-hmm. So, you're getting the amygdala firing off constantly. Most of the time, they're false alarms. The class is not laughing at you. There's not a vicious dog coming towards you. It's a perception of a threat, because the amygdala is using data from past events and go, I think this is like this, so I'm going to activate you. So
it's got all the metadata around about it. So the metadata plus the information from your senses that you haven't experiencing at the time. Yeah. And it's storing that all as part of that.
But there's another problem with this, is that we don't actually need the thing in the room with us to create the fear. because our minds don't really know the difference between something we're experiencing and something we're actually vividly imagining. So we can think ourselves into anxiety. If you think about standing up in front of all your colleagues and freezing and not being able to speak, and they're all laughing at you, you make a bit of a fool of yourselves, you will actually start to feel like that's happening, and the amygdala will actually start to respond. So our thoughts can trigger our anxiety as well. So when we talked about time traveling earlier, where we're off in the future and we're back in the past, we're actually triggering ourselves. So you're just walking around in your daily life, just trying to get on with things, and the amygdala is just firing off left, right, and centre. And this is the issue. What's actually happening is, it's a bit like you've walked into your kitchen and you've popped the kettle on, and suddenly the smoke alarm starts going off, and you're like, it's steam. But the amygdala's going, no, it's smoke, it's fire, run. And these triggers just build and build and build and build, and that person just walks around and goes, I don't understand why I'm like this. And what we actually have to do is get the amygdala to reprocess the information that's stored within it. And for people that have had panic attacks, certainly for me, there was data about each panic attack, because one was on a plane, so I didn't want to be on a plane. Another one was on a car. Another one, I had a panic attack in an accident and emergency at a hospital. So my anxiety said, a hospital's not safe. So I started to avoid that. You'll get people that have maybe had a panic attack in the supermarket, don't want to go to the supermarket. But it's not just about having panic attacks, it's about feeling uncomfortable in any situation where the amygdala is activated, and then it starts to use that data going forwards, and it's running the show.
It sounds like it is definitely running the show.
Yeah.
And to a certain extent, it then also means that anxiety is different for everybody, how you experience it and what the cause is, as well as the effect on you, because everyone will probably have different symptoms. You hear a lot about the different symptoms. So it's very much a personalised experience. Yeah. Yeah,
and that can be, that doesn't need to be you're afraid of public speaking, or that can be anything. It can be a dog, it can be a cat, it can be certain foods, maybe as a child, or at any point in life you're eating a certain food and you've had an unexpected texture or taste, or something happens to you and there's a stress state that's activated, and suddenly this anxiety starts to happen. But it's all driven by that. And the problem is that our brain, I'm probably do some plinky plonky brain science right now, but our brains basically do something called dual processing. I don't know if you've read the chimp paradox.
Yeah.
Kind of think of the inner chimp. So our brain doing this dual processing where we've got fast brain, very fast brain thinking. That's our emotional brain. Our emotional brain is super fast, bearing in mind that anxiety, emotion. And then we have prefrontal cortex activity, clear, calm, rational thinking, problem solving part of the brain, the part of the brain that actually helps us regulate emotion. When anything tends to happen to us in life, the emotional brain is there like in seconds. And then a few minutes later, like the rational brain, kind of like a bit of an old man, comes dawdling up going, so what's going on here then? By which point the emotional brain's going, it's all going wrong, we're all going to die, it's all absolutely horrendous. And the rational brain's trying to get a look in, and the emotional brain is running the show. And anxiety recovery is actually about using tools to give the chance for the rational brain to turn up to the situation and help you regulate what is happening, rather than the feeling being that intense, we avoid the situation. Because the amygdala, when you avoid something, gets a negative experience. It goes, see, you didn't want to go walking through that park because there's danger there. I'm justified in keeping the anxiety up.
So it's got a fast track effectively. So whenever you get the feeling in your stomach or whatever it is that's causing it, those signals have almost got a fast track straight to your amygdala before it actually reaches that part of your brain.
Yeah.
So that's understandable, because really, when you're in a fight or flight, a genuine fight or flight situation, you don't want to think, what do I do now? You don't need to emotionally regulate. You don't need to do any of these things. You just need to survive.
Yeah.
So that's really interesting that it's got that fast track.
But the amygdala removes the ability for you at a rational level to work out what's going on, because if you sit at a conscious level and go, oh, should I do this or should I do that? You could die. So if you were about to step off the pavement and a car nearly hits you and you get that and you jump back, if amygdala didn't jump in at that point and you stayed in conscious sort of prefrontal cortex, shall I go left, shall I go right, shall I... Boom, dead. So it shuts off that ability and it starts to run the show. So in certain sets of circumstances, absolutely, you 100% need the amygdala there. It primes you for real world danger. But we were talking about me earlier, because during the earlier stages of my life, my relationship with my amygdala was not a healthy one, because there was a lot of worry. There was a lot of anxiety. There was a lot of uncertainty. And this happens for a lot of people. So what actually happens is, for long periods of life, the amygdala is going on and off, almost daily, weekly, on and off. So what the amygdala does is it goes like, rather than me doing this on and off, I'll just kind of stay on. Let's just stay primed.
So it's hyper alert.
Hyper alert, hypervigilance. Where's the attack coming from? Where's the next bit of, where's the next threat? A bit like those poor soldiers during the war down in the trenches, and they're waiting for the whistle to blow to go up over the top. You're in this hypervigilant state, waiting, and while you're in this state, what does the amygdala do? Or, what happens to our physiology is all of our senses get cranked to the max.
They do. And you also really release all of those chemicals that gets your body ready to react.
Yeah.
So you've got that big cortisol spike, that
adrenaline.
That you keep, So you've got your cortisol to your stay awake, and then you've got your adrenaline to take action and get energy and run. But that can't be in a good place to have that all the time, because then cortisol is a silent killer, isn't it? It's not good to have that going through. It's there to serve a purpose in a crisis. It's not there to be consistent.
Yeah, we're not designed to be in sort of permanent fight or flight mode. It's designed for short periods of activity. And the problem is, so if we use the dark alley analogy, you're walking down a dark alley and somebody jumps out, you get that, is, the amygdala activates and you get this bucket of adrenaline and cortisol dropped into the system, floods the system, and you either fight, you freeze, you run, or sometimes you fawn, curl up into a ball. When you go through life and there's this been going on a lot, the adrenaline and cortisol is like a tap that's been left dripping, drip, drip, drip. So it's constantly in your system. And lots of cortisol in your system can lead to a fatigue, brain fog. But being in and out of fight or flight a lot changes the way that you think, feel and behave. The anxiety will create notions. You just think differently. It's like your spidey senses are dialed to absolutely maximum. You're very aware of feelings that are going on in your body. Your sense of smell, your hearing, everything is just really super, super vigilant, because you're on edge. You're waiting for that next attack, and it's a horrible way to exist. And the way that you think in that situation is, internal dialogue changes to lots of what if or I thinks. Because what the amygdala is doing is anything in your life, it's looking at it and it's risk assessing it. Where's the danger? Where's the danger? Where's the danger? And actually what's happening is that your internal security system is just working way too efficiently. It's in full-blown overdrive. And it's just not a nice place to be at all. And because of the way that we feel as a result of this, our behaviours actually keep us trapped in fight or flight.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
It's not a good one, but it makes sense as to why that's happening, because it replicates,
Yeah.
and the body then says, I'm anxious,
Yeah.
and here's another experience of it. So again, that you've got that heightened awareness.
Yeah, and the thing is, anxiety actually requires our attention. Do you think about it? If your attention is elsewhere, anxiety really does lose its power. And this is really useful for people that are struggling with anxiety to listen. We can't have two thoughts at the same time. We're either thinking anxiety or we're somewhere else. Yes, the feelings of anxiety can take a while to dissipate, but people with anxiety, what they need to understand is that their brain, or our brains, the human brain, is a problem-solving machine. Our brain loves to solve problems, how to get from A to B.
It does.
How to do this thing, how to learn that. What do I need to get from the shops later? All of the brain loves that stuff. But when you've got anxiety, the brain kind of flips mode and goes, we don't solve problems anymore. We create problems. So the brain goes into problem creation mode. What if that goes wrong? I think this may happen. What ifs? And it's that does that time travelling that we were talking about earlier, off into the future, trying to predict outcomes and control them. How can you control something that's not even happened yet?
Yes.
Looking at the
So is it
past.
asking questions then to create the problems to give you something to solve? To keep you busy solving problems?
Doing anxiety.
Yeah.
It needs to keep you busy doing anxiety, which is we need to risk assess everything in our environment. And it almost gets to the point where they make us like, I just think everything's trying to kill us. Nothing appears safe. A lot of people with anxiety tend to have what I call safe spaces. I'm at home with my mum, or as if I can just get to this place. And some of the rules that we write, I had a rule once when my anxiety was so bad years ago, I could go no more than 15 minutes from home. If I could get home in 10, 15 minutes, I would be okay. But any further than that, bedlam.
And was that an arbitrary value that you created, that 15 minutes?
Yeah, I don't know how it happened. What happened was I was out with friends once. We were at a pub and my anxiety really got out of check. I was sitting there and I was masking, no one knew. I had a drink to see if I could take the edge off it, and I could just feel the anxiety building and building and building, and I knew there was a panic attack coming. And I knew I could get home in about 10 minutes. And I jumped in a taxi and I went home, and my anxiety then went. So from that moment on, my brain went, as long as I'm within that distance. But if I'd probably been 20 minutes away, I would have ended up having a full-blown panic attack in the taxi. So I then started to create all these rules, all these safety checks. So if people invite me out, they'd be like, where are we going? And I'd look, how far away is it? Can I sit near the exit? Is it dead open or is it enclosed? How many people are going? Can I drive there? Can I park near the door? Is there a bus? Is there lots of taxis around? Because my brain started to write all these rules. I am safe as long as all these things are in place. And that's where life can get very, very small. And that's where the brain is just constantly looking at the dangers. And it's amazing the rules that the brain will write. And it's because of all this data that's down in the amygdala. I've had clients who've, even at a superficial level, somebody said something to them early in life, something about their physical appearance. I do a bit of work with people that work in trichology, work with the hair, and somebody said to them early age, your hair it seems to be very thin. Maybe you're losing your hair. And that's said to them at a very, very early age, but later in life, they're checking hair out in mirrors, or, they're worried about something else happening to them. And this is what anxiety will take something and literally turn it into a threat. So, that's how you can get OCD traits, or you can get social anxiety because you want to avoid these crowds because you don't want that attention, or you don't want to be humiliated. And here's it's not a funny thing, but to show you the way that an anxious brain works. So years ago, my symptoms of anxiety were I would have tight chest, so I'd have chest pains, and I would start to do safety checks. I'd be like checking my throat was clear, and I know it sounds stupid, I'm going, can I breathe properly? For people that have struggled with anxiety, this ability of can I breathe properly is quite a big deal. So we started to do these safety checks. But anyway, again, back to the point, I'd had this chest pain and it had been going on for a couple of weeks. And I was like, something doesn't feel right here. So it was like back to almost my personal ward at A&E with like, I've got this chest pain. And it actually turned out that I had a blood clot. And so I went in, did the procedure, cleared and all the rest of it. And this was back in the day where the day you were due to be discharged, you had to wait for like the doctor to do his rounds to talk to you. So I was actually in quite a good place. This was before the wave of chronic panic attacks came after this episode. So hospitals were a safe space to me. So anyway, this doctor's coming around and I can still see it now. It was the last bed. I was right at the end and he came up to me and he picked up my chart. He's like, my God, when you came in, your heart rate was this and your blood pressure was that. It was really high. Let's just do your heart rate now and your blood pressure. Oh, it's fantastic. It's really, really good. And then he kind of hung the clipboard back up on the end of the bed and he went to turn away, and I'll never forget this, and he looked back and he went, you're a really lucky boy. And I was like, what do you mean? He went, well, if that blood clot had hit your heart, you would have died. And I'm like, oh, right, okay. Put my clothes on and left. But that was the beginning of a whole new chapter of anxiety, because any pain in my body, any sensation, my anxiety was now going, we mustn't die. Any pain in your body is a threat. So we all get aches and pains and things, don't we? But I was like, my fingers are tingling. This is another blood clot. This is that.
Health anxiety is actually huge now.
The health
especially
anxiety.
after COVID.
Yeah.
And people going back to work and everything.
Yeah.
But I've seen a huge spike in health-related anxiety on the back of it.
So
is that what you're almost describing there?
So yeah, I ended up in four. So I already had anxiety. I now had health anxiety, and my fairly infrequent panic attacks now turned into almost daily panic attacks. I mean, at my worst, I would have 4 or 5 panic attacks a day. Some of them were absolutely horrendous, and some I ended up in A&E with. And people may laugh at this, or you may not understand it, but when a doctor stands at the end of your bed and said you could have died, that's trauma. Mm-hmm. In that moment, you suddenly realised you were very close to death. So it's like PTSD. Didn't know that at the time. So I leave the hospital with this traumatic thing that's now happened to me, and those words of that doctor in my head. And now the amygdala's now going, I need to look out for this, I need to look out for that. And yeah, that was a whole different battle with different anxieties. But what I'm trying to get across on this episode is that how really it doesn't need to be major life events like a blood clot or an accident. It can be standing up in a classroom, being chastised by somebody, by having a critical parent, by having a fall, or, that can lead to horrendous anxiety, because our brains are amazingly quick at putting us into survival mode. That threat system kicking in. Our brains are very reluctant to let us back out. They will go, I'll just keep you here because it might not be fun, but you're alive. And that's where we have to do the work. It sucks. It's not fun. It's hard work. It takes consistency and effort. But if that's you, you're going to have to do the work. Because there is no magic wand. There's no silver bullet. You have to do work on yourself to get yourself out of that.
So you had said at the beginning, Andy, on taking action earlier, makes for a quicker recovery on the back of that. Mm-hmm. Is that we know that neuroplasticity in the brain makes for longer things, and it becomes more habitual, and it's the habitual habits that take longer to fix
Yeah.
it. So when you say it's easier to recover quicker, is there at that point still stuff without referring to Google that people can do
So
to help themselves?
Yeah. So going back to the longer you leave it, the more difficult it is. What I meant by that was there's two things that happen when you've had anxiety for a long period of time. You get lots of triggers, things that set you off that fundamentally need to be collapsed. You need to get the amygdala to no longer see them as a threat. They need to be reprocessed, released and let go. So the longer anxiety's been running, the more triggers there are, these slow building triggers that need to be collapsed. But on top of that, there are habits that are created. So safety checks, protocols that you've run that actually are part of you starting to do anxiety. Checking how far away it is. Is there going to be any dogs there? How many people are in the room? Checking your throat that you can breathe. Looking at your hair in the mirror. Checking your skin. All of these things. If you've had anxiety for a long time, you've ran those behaviours. They've become habitual. Your brain is now wired to do those things. So you're right, neuroplasticity is the key to getting over anxiety, rewiring the brain to actually, I know we used to do that, but we now want to do this response instead. That old phrase, old dog, new tricks.
Yeah.
It does take consistency. And to go back to your question about what can we do, your anxiety recovery has to involve structure and process with consistency. So you need the right set of tools for the right form of anxiety that you're struggling with. So some people have a lot of what we call cortex-based anxiety. It's very much their thought, their thinking. Yeah. And then there's other people that have got amygdala-based anxiety where they feel like they're just walking around and suddenly they're going in and out of fight or flight and they're not so aware of thoughts. Or they might have both of those. And they're both dealt with slightly differently. So for things like thoughts, a therapist should be working with you on pattern interrupts, stuff about protecting your state, bringing you back into the moment and closing thoughts down. One of the things I teach my clients for dealing with thoughts is the stop technique. So when they've become involved in internal dialogue and they're trapped in thought, to bring themselves, I just get them inside their heads to say to themselves, stop. And I just get them to count 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and just pull their mind back into what they're doing. Some people will twang an elastic band, but it's about protecting your state. With amygdala-based anxiety, where you're just minding your own business and it's firing off left, right, and centre because the amygdala's picked up on something in your environment it's not happy with, it has to be shown that that's a false alarm. So what do we do in those moments? We have to regulate the emotion. We have to take care of our physiology. We focus on our breathing. We keep our thoughts very much in the moment. We try to reactivate the prefrontal cortex to actually say, no, that was a false trigger. I don't want you firing that. So do you remember I said earlier in the episode, it's about what you do in those moments when you feel anxiety that will determine how quickly you get better. That's where recovery happens. We don't get better by trying to avoid feeling anxious. But nobody ever tells us this stuff.
No, and there are different, we're all different. Right? So again, some strategies will work if you're working individually without the use of a therapist.
Yeah.
There'll be some strategies that will actually just click with you, that will work with you. So, for example, I think it was Beyonce for coming out in stage performance, she has an alter ego where she creates this additional person. Nick Kershaw, I'm a big fan, he has his anxiety buddy, and he's called Frank, where he actually places the behaviour into somebody else, which then lets him view it from externally and manage it from that perspective. you've got internal dialogue. There's so many different ways that you can do it.
Yeah, there's no one size fits all mentality
For the generalised anxiety.
What works for you might not work for me, and vice versa. There are certain sets of tools that are just refined slightly to work for you. But the key thing is...
So you're talking about for self-help rather than for therapy.
So,
absolutely.
There's so much... The internet is a sea of misinformation when it comes to anxiety. Anxiety fundamentally has two stages: inclination and take hold, right? At inclination, that's where you start doing the work. You read all this stuff on the internet that, in the middle of a panic attack, name 5 things you can touch. You can't do anything when you're in a panic attack. Rational thinking is switched off. The secret is don't get to panic attack. Start to regulate your breathing and your thought patterns with the right sets of tools. When I work with people in the practice that are struggling with panic attacks, we have to be very careful of the different types of breathing exercises that they do, because people that have had panic attacks have a strange relationship with breathing. They think about it a lot, and actually, weirdly, focusing on your breathing is like a threat. So, using my own personal experience of struggling with panic attacks, we take things very gently, very easily. But the thing is, right, your ability to heal yourself from anxiety is way better than any tablet out there. Don't get me wrong, some medications can provide that period of stability and calm for you to do the work. But fundamentally, medication's not changing anything. It's not reprogramming the amygdala. It's hoping that it calms you down for a bit. Then during that period of calm, something changes. But that information's still trapped in the amygdala.
There.
It's still there.
Yeah.
So you'll get a lot of people going, and my anxiety went away for 3 years, and then it came back again. It was always there. It was all, that is so common. I thought I was healed, and then suddenly this thing needs to reprocess some information and some of your old habits and patterns. Maybe your life has just been in a way that you've accommodated your triggers. You've managed to live your life in a way where your triggers don't get to fire off, but the information is still down in your Netflix catalogue. So... Yeah.
So I was just actually thinking about what you were saying there about when... So I'm aware of the amygdala, the 5-second rule, the whole protection thing. One of the aspects that I've always found interesting is that when you go into that flight, you were saying about 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 technique, then you've got the ping something or the other CBT initiatives. A lot of the people don't realise that, or tend to forget that when you go into that fight or flight, you do have that hormonal rush. Your body has been flooded with cortisol and adrenaline. And to do that, your prefrontal cortex has been switched off, the blood supply to it's gone. So you don't have the capacity to stop and think. But you are flooded with this capability of high energy state.
Yeah.
So for some people, doing something with that high energy to process, to get rid of that adrenaline and that cortisol to actually work its way out, can that help them then come down from that state?
100%. So anxiety is a state shift. So when we're generally doing anxiety, what tends to happen is the shoulders drop forwards, the head will come down, and we're kind of like that. Or we're very much focused on the thing, the hair, this, that, the breathing, the pain in the chest, we become absolutely fixated on it. There's a pattern. I promise you, any of you listening to this doing anxiety, when you find yourself in a better place, if you stop and think about what happens, generally what happens is, so for me, what would happen is I would just start to feel something in my chest. And the next thing is I would feel something in my throat. And what I would do is I would do this, and I'd start to check that I could swallow properly. That was stage 2 of about 5 of me going towards a panic attack. If I can do something at stage 1 or 2 differently, the likelihood of me getting to panic attack is hugely different. And, human beings, we're all wired the same. We all respond. Our stress responses, when we're in stress, we do one or two things. We either go and hold our breath, or our breathing, we kind of start to breathe in quite a bad way. If you ever experience somebody having a panic attack, they're gulping in air, and they're like sucking in air like it's going out of fashion, but they're hardly breathing out. These tiny little out breaths. Yeah. We can't help it. It's just what human beings do. But if we can regulate the breathing way before panic attack stage, where I like 3, 4, 5 breathing, in for 3, hold for 4, out for 5, where the emphasis is pushing the carbon dioxide out the system, and regulate that breathing. But also, let's look at what we're doing something like 3, 4, 5. We're using numbers, and we're knowingly breathing. Prefrontal cortex activity. I need to get this bad boy back in the game, not in the emotional brain. So getting up and moving, breathing, we're counting numbers. There's loads of different things that you can do. But at low levels, at inclination stage, you've got to have the emotional regulation to go, my anxiety started to come up. So I'm going to use the tools and processes to bring it back down. So, anxiety, I work with it on a scale of 1 to 10. 1 is I'm fine, 10's get me a paramedic. As soon as you notice it's come up to like a 3 or a 4, you're taking action to get it back down into those single numbers again. You're not letting it get up to 8, 9, 10 where there's going to be a crescendo. It's going to blow up. You don't let it get to that point. And here's the thing, when anxiety comes up, you push it back down, you start to grow personal confidence. And every single time you push that anxiety back down, that's one more step to you coming closer to not ever having to do it. And here's the thing, when you stop worrying about being anxious and you just don't care if that emotion turns up and you don't give it the attention, it ultimately goes away. But it requires your focus.
It requires that focus and attention, doesn't it? It requires, it's like a tennis match. If it's throwing you a ball and you don't hit it back, it's got nothing to bounce off of. It's got no response.
A lot of people that struggle with anxiety, whether they're at work or they're doing something they enjoy or a TV program, when they're engrossed in something else, anxiety will leave them alone. But, anxiety to me is like this little ninja that sits on your shoulder and you're just walking around and it's like, they're busy now, leave them alone. Their senses are engaged in other things. But maybe watching the telly and it's not really competing for your attention. So you're not in it, but your mind's away somewhere else. Or lying in bed with nothing but your thoughts. Anxiety is like, yes, look at all that headspace I can go and consume. So, if you're somebody that does anxiety a lot, take a look at where you are when you're doing it and what your attention is on, and work on coming up with solutions. So, I talked to you about my horrendous situation with panic attacks on flights. So as soon as I get on it was a death march going towards a plane. The boarding gate was like the final curtain. That's where, I was going to die. So, I'm at level 7, 8, 9, 10, getting on the plane like this. What's going to happen and all the rest of it. One day, a very sweet old lady pattern interrupts that whole thing for me. So it was a British Airways flight. I was going to America. Remember being at the gate going, this is the flight. This is the one where, I'm going to die. And got on the plane, sat down, and the sweetest old lady was sat next to me, and she was like, could you do me a favour? Could you put my bag up for me? So I was like, yeah, not a problem. I put the bag up there, and like sweat pouring off me, dying, and I sat back down. And she was just one of these lovely people that started talking to me. She had a really interesting life. She was telling me about this, she was telling me about that, she was asking me questions, talk. Next thing I noticed, we were up in the air. We'd done the whole seatbelts on, taxi after, and I went, and I'll never forget this. It was a bit like there's one of the Werther's Originals advert. She opened her bag and goes, do you want a mint? And I had this surreal moment of going, oh my God, I've not done anxiety. And we chatted a bit more and she fell asleep and the rest of the flight was fine for me. At that point in time, I didn't have the ability to go, why did I not do anxiety at that point? Well, I didn't do it because my attention was elsewhere. My brain was dealing with a different set of problems, which was, this lady's asked me to put a bag up. Mm-hmm. She's asking me questions. I'm listening to her story. My mind is elsewhere. But there was really useful information in that. You know, my pattern of doing anxiety was suddenly interrupted by something else. If that had been a row of 3 seats and it had just been me, game over. Mm-hmm. I would have done anxiety and I would have done it really, really well. So interrupting those patterns is really key.
Definitely. You have got, when you get that cortisol and everything else dumping at the same time, that has other effects on the body, doesn't it?
Huge.
So, for example, not all IBS, but your body's designed to literally dump your bowels and your bladder so that there's no trace when you run from the line, so you can't be found through smell. But there's a whole host of other different things that it also does. It dries up your mouth, there's no saliva. So there's lots of different ways that anxiety can come into your life and affect it. Mm-hmm. But each one's almost a topic in its own sense, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. So, you know, you've got symptoms of anxiety that can present themselves in so many different ways. OCD traits, agoraphobia, IBS, you know, picking at the skin, you know, sort of self-harming and all these different things that we can have. But fundamentally, we don't treat the symptoms. We go direct to the cause. So, and you're right, everybody's different. Everybody's different. Some people feel sick. You know, some people, their bowels just, you know, go to pieces. It's different for everyone. But fundamentally, it's because your anxiety is just too high. And if you deal with that, those other symptoms go away. My panic attacks went away when I dealt with my anxiety, but I had them as two separate, not linked things, and they're intrinsic. There isn't one without the other. Get your anxiety levels down. But because I was like, here's a prescription, off you go, take these for 3 months, see how you get on, they're not working, try these, up the dose, do this, do that. Because I hadn't processed the amygdala information. And also, anybody that's going to therapy, or whatever kind of therapy it is right now, if they've not been given by their therapist a system, a structure, a process and a set of tools to use between sessions so they're empowered, they're not going to get better. They're not. You've got to take personal responsibility for healing your anxiety. Yes, you can get help. Medication can help regulate some of the emotions, but fundamentally, you have to do the work. In those moments of anxiety, you have to use the tools, but so many of us don't want to be uncomfortable and we're afraid.
And it's almost like everything else. You can only use those tools and they'll only come naturally as second nature to you if you practice them.
Yeah.
So the very times that you want to be doing it and practicing those elements is when you're not anxious.
Yeah.
When your prefrontal cortex switched on, so that you can then establish a new habit. So you know what comes next. So I do this, and this, and this in a positive way, just like driving a car.
Yeah.
So that when it actually comes in, your subconscious can run with it, your prehistoric side of the brain can run with it.
You need to... Anxiety recovery is about what you do in those moments when you feel like all's going to hell, but also in those moments when you feel good. Because in those moments where you feel good, you build resilience. You put a buffer between you and the anxiety response. So on that day, you go, I feel great today. Good. I'm still doing these techniques. I'm still using these tools, because that's where recovery really accelerates. So it's that balance of the two. But fundamentally, you have to turn up with the right tool, structure and process as much as anxiety does. Anxiety doesn't take a day off. It doesn't get furloughed.
It's invited to everything as well. It doesn't seem to have anything where it's not invited
It's
to.
like the worst house guest that just came for a week and is still there 20 years later. They won't leave. But the thing is, when you do run a system, a structure and a process with the right set of tools and you become empowered, the first situation you find yourself in where you're feeling anxiety but you use the tools and you get through it, the growth, the shift is huge. I didn't realise that thing that I did on that flight that day unintentionally gave me a massive shove in the right direction. And the next flight was 40% easier, and the next flight after that was so much easier, and all the rest of it. But if you're going to therapy or you're just taking medication, the harsh reality is, and I hate to be the bearer of bad news, is there's people been taking anti-anxiety medications for years and years and years and years and years, and they still have anxiety. They're not working because they're not changing anything. They're either trying to suppress, make it more bearable. It's like, why am I having anxiety in the first place? What's the information my brain is deciding to use to create anxiety? What trauma have I been through? What am I trying to avoid? What's the problem in my environment? What was the initial message? Has the message been acknowledged, and doing the work? And that, for me, afterwards, once I found effective forms of therapy and dealt with like the blood clot issue and the flying issue and some of the stuff that happened to me in childhood, and reprocessed it, it was only then I could have a positive relationship with anxiety. But I think when you've had anxiety and you've had excessive anxiety, your relationship with anxiety is different for the rest of your life. And I don't mean that in a bad way. You just have this level of awareness about yourself and your needs. And you probably will use a lot of the tools. You'll keep yourself in a good place, because all of us have this ability for anxiety to get out of check. Every single one of us, even if you're the most chilled dude on the planet, that system can decide to come in and take over. And fundamentally, anxiety recovery is about doing the work when you feel least like doing the work. Just like getting fit, going to the gym. But we're working on the muscles, the brain.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. And one of the things that when I had the anxiety, I had a lot of OCD, a lot of open behaviour loops.
Yeah.
That impacted my work, that impacted everything. And looking back at it, you can see it clearly for what it is then. But when you're in the middle of it, it just all makes sense. It makes sense to you to do things this way. And then latterly, I just lost my voice. My voice went completely and utterly.
Right.
But it comes back to the first that I knew about it was when my voice just went. Mm-hmm. And it took me a long time to learn the tools. Yeah. So that I didn't get to the stage of losing my voice. Yeah. And it would normally be mid... Okay, right. Uh-huh. I can see that actually I have now passed that threshold. Yeah. And it was really obvious.
The body and the mind have these fascinating ways of making us sit up and pay attention and do things.
It was effective.
Yeah, really effective.
Because I like to talk, and it was really obvious to people that I wasn't talking. Yeah. Do you know, so it was one of these, it was probably the most effective way of communicating to me that actually I need to take a step back and address this.
But so, if you're listening to this episode and you are struggling with anxiety and you do not have a set of tools in your toolbox to deal with the thoughts and to regulate the emotions, to regulate the feelings, to protect your state, you need to stack that toolbox with breathing techniques. A lot of people roll their eyes at me when I talk about breathing, but the impact on our psychology and physiology is huge.
Well, it's all proven by science now, actually, isn't it?
More so, Wim Hof and all these people now talking about it. And
activation of the parasympathetic system to say, actually, everything's good.
Yeah, you need to calm that system down. Think of your anxiety system as like a crying baby. It needs to be calmed, it needs to be nurtured, it needs to be done consistently to bring this sense of calm about. And there's a set of tools to do that. Different tools work for different people, so the more tools you can stack in your box. But if you're going for anxiety therapy and you're not being given tools, you're heading off down a path that's not going to work. If you're ending up going to speak to your GP today about anxiety, you need to go, okay, I've got this medication, but what happens now? I need a set of tools to help me deal with this. If they're not talking to you about significant events that you've been through in life, then they're missing a key point. Your brain didn't wake up one day and went, oh, I know, this will be fun, let's just do a whole load of anxiety. Something has happened. You may be consciously aware of what that thing is. You may have no idea what that thing is, but something has happened that switched that system on. And until that information is reprocessed, released and let go, this thing, the amygdala, is going to keep you in fight or flight. You need to retrain the response, and we'll attach a PDF to this episode with some hints and tips and tools that you can use to help you. But fundamentally, if you are struggling, you've got to do the work. You really have got to do the work. And in future episodes we'll talk about some of the traits you've mentioned today, like OCD. Mm-hmm. But fundamentally, people need to understand underpinning that is there's no OCD if there's no anxiety.
That's right.
The one doesn't exist without the other. My panic disorder, because I was so afraid of panic attacks, wouldn't have existed if I didn't have excessive anxiety. I now have healthy levels of anxiety that go, oh God, I need to get that done. Don't forget about this. Make sure you get that right. Anxiety that keeps me functioning and wants me to do well. That's healthy. So it's about creating that healthy relationship with anxiety kind of going forwards. But hopefully the people listening to this have found this episode useful. We're going to be talking in the next episode about people pleasing.
People pleasing.
Another classic trait of people that struggle with
anxiety and sense of self.
Yeah,
absolutely.
hot topics that we're talking about. So we will attach a PDF to this episode with a few hints and tips to help you look after yourself. If you've got any questions or any personal experience, we'd love to hear from you. Drop us a comment, give us a like, please subscribe, and we'll endeavour to answer questions on future episodes. So for myself and Suzanne, thanks very much for listening, and we look forward to speaking with you in the next episode.
If you or someone close to you needs to access mental health support, please contact your GP, or if it's out with normal office hours, get in touch with NHS 24 on 111. Alternatively, contact the Samaritans on 116 123. All calls are free of charge from any phone. You can also find more support information on the Tickety Boo website, ticketyboopodcast.co.uk.